Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Jaya Gopi Channavala Girivaradari Gopi Channavala Girivaradari Yashodanandana Braja Janaranjana Yashodanandana Braja Janaranjana Yamuna Tira Vanachari Yamuna Tira Vanachari Jai Radha Madhava Kunja Vihari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Vihari Jaya Gopi Channavalabha Girivaradari Gopi Channavalabha Girivaradari Jaya Yashodanandana Braja Janaranjana Yashodanandana Braja Janaranjana Yamunatira Vanachari Yamunatira Vanachari Jayam Radha Madhava Kunda Bihari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Jaya Gopi Jana Vallabha Girivaradha Gopi Jana Vallabha Girivaradha Jaya Yashodanandana Braja Janaranjana Yashodanandana Braja Janaranjana Yamuna Tira Vanachari Yamuna Tira Vanachari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Hare Krishna Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama Hare Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama Hare Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama Hare Rama 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 Hare Hare Jaya Radha Damodara Radha Damodara Shri Radhe Jaya Gauranitai Gauranitai Jaya Gauranitai Jaya Gauranitai Jaya Prabhupada 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 Jaya Prabhupada Jayo Vishnupada Paramahamsa Bharivajakacharya Astottara Sata Shri Srimad Divine Grace Srila A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada Ki Jaya Jayam Vishnupada Paramahamsa Bharivajakacharya Astottara Sata Shri Srimad Divine Grace Srila Bhaktivedanta Saraswati Thakur Goswami Maharaj Srila Prabhupada Ki Jaya Grantaraj Srimad Bhagavatam Ki Jani Tagore Premanandi Haribol Nama Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prastaya Bhutale Srimate Devamrita Swami Nitanamne Purvadaksham Cha Bhaktijan Vivinata Paratita Pakananam Yasasarvechite Namaha Namam Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prasthaya Bhutale Srimate Bhaktivedanta Swami Namane Namaste Saraswati Devi Gauravani Pachayani Nir Vishesha Shunyavadi Paschatya Shatani Ne Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Hare Krishna, dear devotees, we're reading from the King of Books, the Amala Purana, the Purana Arka, the Sun-like Purana, Srimad Bhagavatam, 5th canto, the Creative Impetus, last chapter, number 26, description of the hellish planets. Also known as a description of Parikshit Maharaj's care and concern for the living entities who are suffering in material existence. Yes, he begins this chapter by asking what, of course, describes in vivid detail, such as is sufficient to shock and awe us. And in the beginning of the 6th canto, of course, begins with the story of Ajamil and the process of liberation from those hellish planets. So it's not indulgence in gore, indulgence in horror, like we might be inclined to. There's this thing called rubbernecking. There's some accident on the highway. Everybody wants to see. Maybe there's a body or something. And it's pretty crude. But that's not what's going on here. The description of these hellish planets is inspired by Maharaj Parikshit's concern for what all the living entities are doing in this material world and how they may be emancipated. So let's keep that in mind as we're reading text number 7. Tatra haike narakan ekavimshatim ganayanti atatam ste rajan namarupa lakshanato dukramishyamastamisro ndatamisro rauravo maharoravaha kumbipakaha kalasutram asipatravanam sukkaramukam andakupaha krimibhojanaha sandamkshas taptasurmir vajra kantaka shalmali Vaitarani Puyodaha Pranarodo Vishasanam Lalabakshaha Sarameyadanam Avichir Ayachapanam Iti Kinchak Sharakardamo Rakshogana Bhojanaha Shula Protodhanda Shuko Vata Nirodanaha Aryavartanaha Suchimukam Ityashta Vimshatir Naraka Vividhayatana Bhumayaha. Translation, word for word translation says Tatra, there, ha, certainly, eke, some, Narakan, the hellish planets. Eka Vimshatim, 21, Ganayanti, count, ata, therefore, tan, them, te, unto you, Rajan, O king, Namarupa Lakshanataha, according to their names, forms, and symptoms. Anukramishamaha, we shall outline one after another. Tamishraha, Tamisra. Andatamishraha, Andatamishra. Rauravaha, Raurava. Maharorava, Maharorava. Kumbhipakaha, Kumbhipaka. Kalasutram, Kalasutra. You'll just read all these names once instead of translating from the noun form to the nominative form. Maharorava, Kumbhipaka, Kalasutra, Asipatravana, Shukkaramukha, Andakupa, Krimibhojana, Sandamksha, Taptasurmi, Vajrakantaka, Shalmali, Vaitarani, Puyoda, Pranaroda, Vishasana, Lalabaksha, Sarameyadana, Avichi, Ayapana, Iti, thus, Kincha, some more, Kshara Kardamaha, Ksharakardama, Rakshagana Bhojana, oh, there's more. Rakshagana Bhojana, Shula Prota, Dandashuka, Avatanirodha, Prayavartana, Shuchimuka, Iti, in this way, Ashtavimshatihi, 28, Naraka, hellish planets, Vivida, various, Yatana, Bhumayaha, lands of suffering and hellish condition. Whew. Translation by His Divine Grace, Srila A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada, Prabhupada Ki Jai. Some authorities say that there is a total of 21 hellish planets, and some say 28. My dear king, I shall outline all of them according to their names, forms, and symptoms. The names of the different hells are as follows. Should we read them all again? Third time? We should. Tamishra, Andatamishra, Raurava, Maharourava, Kumbhipaka, Kalasutra, Asipatravana, Shukramuka, Andakupa, Krimibhojana, Sandamksha, Taptasurmi, Vajrakantaka, Shalmali, Vaitarani, Puyodha, Pranarodha, Vishasana, Lalabhaksha, Sarmeyada, Avichi, Ayapana, Ksharakardama, Arakshogana Bhojana, Shulaprota, Dandashuka, Avatanirodhana, Paryavartana, and Suchimuka. All these planets are meant for punishing the living entities. Text number 8. Tatrayastu paravitapataya vitapatya kalatranya apararati sahi kalapasha bhado yamapurushayar ati bhayanakais tamisre narake bhalam nipatyate anashananudapana dhandatadana santarjanadibhir yatana bhiryatyamano janturyatra kashmalam asadita ekadaiva murcham upayati tamishra prayahe. Tatra, in those hellish planets, you have a person who, two, but paravitta apatya kalatrani, the money, wife, and children of another. Aparati takes away. Saha, that person. He, certainly. Kalapasha badaha, being bound by the ropes of time or Yamaraj. Yamapurusahai, by the assistance of Yamaraj. Atibhayanakai, who are very fearful. Tamisre narake, into the hell known as Tamisre. Balat, by force. Nipatyate, is thrown. Anashana, starvation. Anudapana, without water. Dandatadana, beaten with rods. Santarjana adibihi, by scolding and so on. Yatanabihi, by severe punishments. Yatyamanaha, being punished. Jantuhu, the living entity. Yatra, where. Kashmalam, misery. Asaditaha, obtained. Ekada, sometimes. Eva, certainly. Murchaham, fainting. Upayati, obtains. Tamishar praye, in that condition which is almost entirely dark. Translation by His Divine Grace, Sri Prabhupada. My dear king, a person who appropriates another's legitimate wife, children, or money is arrested at the time of death by the fierce Yamadutas who bind him with the rope of time and forcibly throw him into the hellish planet known as Tamisra. On this very dark planet, the sinful man is chastised by the Yamadutas, who beat and rebuke him. He is starved, and he is given no water to drink. Thus, the wrathful assistants of Yamaraj cause him severe suffering, and sometimes he faints from their chastisement. Text number 9. Evam dattamisreyastu vanchayitva purusham dharadin upayuntayatra sariri nipatyamano yatanasto vedanaya nashtamatir nashtadrishtischa bhavati yatha vanaspatir vrishchyamanamulas tasmad antartamishram tam upadishanti. Evam, in this way, Eva, certainly, Andatamishre, in the hellish planet known as Andatamishre. Yaha, The person who to but vanchayitva, cheating. Purusham, another person. Dara adin, the wife and children. Upayunkte, enjoys. Yatra, where. Shariri, the embodied person. Nipatyamanaha, being forcibly thrown. Yatanasta, always situated in extremely miserable conditions. Vedanaya, by such suffering. Nashta, lost. Matihi, whose consciousness. Nashta, lost. Drishti, whose sight. Cha, also. Bhavati, becomes. Yata, as much as. Vanaspatihi, the trees. Vrishchamana, being cut. Mula, whose root. Tasmat, because of this. Andatamishram, Andatamishra. Tam, that. Upadishanti, they call. The destination of a person who slyly cheats another man and enjoys his wife and children is the hell known as Andatamisha. There, his condition is exactly like that of a tree being chopped at its roots. Even before reaching Andatamishra, the sinful living entity is subjected to various extreme miseries. These afflictions are so severe that he loses his intelligence and sight. It is for this reason that learned sages call this hell Andatamishra. And text number 10. Yastviha va etad aham iti mamedam iti bhutadrohena kevalam svakutumbham evanudinam prapushnati satad iha vihaya swayam eva tad ashubhena raurave nipatati. Yaha, one who, two, but, iha, in this life, va, or, etat, this body, aham, I, iti, thus, mama, mine, idam, this, iti, thus, bhutarohena, by envy of other living entities, kevalam, alone, svakutumbam, his family members, eva, on, anudinam, day to day, prapushnati, supports, saha, such a person, tat, that, iha, here, vihaya, giving up, swayam, personally, eva, certainly, tat, of that ashubhena, by the sin, raurave, in raurava, nipatati, he falls down. Translation and purport by His Divine Grace, Srila A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada. A person who accepts his body as his self works very hard day and night for money to maintain his own body and the bodies of his wife and children. While working to maintain himself and his family, he may commit violence against other living entities. Such a person is forced to give up his body and his family at the time of death, when he suffers the reaction for his envy of other creatures by being thrown into the hell called Aurorava. In Srimad Bhagavatam, it is said, Yasyatma buddhi kunape tridatuke svadhi kalatradishu homa ijati yatirtha buddhi shalilena karhichich janeshva vigyeshu sa eva gokra. One who accepts this bodily bag of three elements, bile, mucus, and air. That's the Ayurvedic perspective, by the way. Anyone who has ever done Ayurveda knows that there's Vata dosha, Pitta dosha, Kapha dosha. And in the Western form of Ayurveda, we call it air fire. It's actually gas, bile, and mucus. And these are the three elements. Anyway, one who accepts this bodily bag of three elements, bile, mucus, and air, as his self, who has an affinity for an intimate relationship with his wife and children, who considers his land worshipable, who takes bath in the waters of the holy places of pilgrimage, but never takes advantage of those persons who are in actual knowledge, he is no better than an ass or a cow. There are two classes of men absorbed in the material concept of life. Out of ignorance, a man in the first class thinks his body to be his self, and therefore he is certainly like an animal. Sa eva gokara. The person in the second class, however, not only thinks his material body to be his self, but also commits all kinds of sinful activities to maintain his body. He cheats everyone to acquire money for his family and his self, and he becomes envious of others without reason. Such a person is thrown into the hell known as Rodava. If one simply considers his body to be his self, as do the animals, he is not very sinful. However, if one needlessly commits sins to maintain his body, he is put into the hell known as Rodava. This is the opinion of Srila Vishwanatha Chakravarti Thakur. Although animals are certainly in the bodily concept of life, they do not commit any sins to maintain their bodies, mates, or offspring. Therefore, animals do not go to hell. However, when a human being acts enviously and cheats others to maintain his body, he is put into a hellish condition. Om Agyanatimarandasya Gyananjana Shalakaya Chakshurmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manobishtam Stapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Kadamahyam Tadati Swaparantikam Vandeham Shri Guru Shri Yuta Parakammalam Shri Guru Vaishnavam Cha Shri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahagana Raghunatham Vitam Tam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savadutam Prijana Sahitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Param Sahagana Lalitam Shri Vishakanvitam Cha Hey Krishna Karuna Sindhu Dinabandhu Jagatpate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostute Tapta Kanchana Gaurangi Radhe Vrindavaneshwari Rishabhanu Sutta Devi Pranamami Hari Priya Vanchakapatarubhyascha Kripasindubhya eva cha Patitanam Bhavibhyo Vaishnavibhyo Namo Namah Jaya Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Shivasari Gaura Bhaktavinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. Hare Krishna. So in these verses and purports, we're hearing a description of the Tamishra hell, Anda Tamishra, and the Rodava hell. The first two, well, all three of them, it's mentioned the bondage to wife and children. It is a bondage, especially when wife and children are exploited for sense gratification, and especially when one willingly, knowingly commits sinful activities to maintain that bondage and that sense gratification. Which is remarkable because it's difficult to maintain wife and children. But we should recognize that the bodily concept of life and the subsequent bondage as a result is not an innocent affair. It's not an innocent affair because it stems from ignorance. Its end result, if followed to its natural end, the result is Tamishra, Anda Tamishra, and Rodava. To recognize this is a result of ignorance. It's not an innocent affair, and it has an end result if not checked by the force of religiosity, dharma, sacrifice, and ultimately Krishna consciousness. We should not think, well, what's the big deal? I've got this body. So what if I enjoy with the body? I mean, I'm not hurting anybody, am I? We may not be as devotees. We try to be principled, ethical, and we try to be Krishna conscious. But we should recognize that any bodily concept of life is playing with fire. And the potential result is being described by Shukadeva Goswami, yes, to shock us, so that we recognize this is a serious thing. It is not a minor thing to be in the bodily concept of life, to willingly create bondage with other bodies, to exploit their bodies. This is not an innocent affair. We should be very careful, because it all stems from ignorance. It must end in pain and suffering. As is said by Lord Kapila Dev in that verse I'm going to remember in just a second. Not Lord Kapila Dev, I'm sorry, but Lord Rishabh Dev. Punkshastriya maintuni bhavametam tayor mitya hridaya grantimahu ato griha kshetra sutapta vitayar janasya mohoyam ahammame. So this is moha, illusion. And it is not an innocent thing. The attraction between male and female, punkshastriya maituni bhav, that attraction seems so much fun. Ooh, when she walks in the room. Can sing 100 pop songs just describing that maituni bhava. And indeed, it is natural, because we are, at least in so much as we are imitating Radha and Krishna, it is natural to have some attraction. But we should recognize that because of that attraction, there are natural results. First of all, there's children. That is the natural result of the sexual activity. Griha, there must be some home. Kshetra, some land. Sutta, the children. Apta, vitayar, all of this, the social networks and communities and everything else that comes about just from this maituni bhava. And that takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of work. Because it is illusion, moha, to be thinking in terms of I and mine, aham mameti. Such a person is inclined to exploit others so that he or she can enjoy the bodies with which they are bound. And this is where the sinful activities accrue, as is being described in this verse especially. While working to maintain himself and his family, he may commit violence against other living entities. We think, I don't commit violence against other living entities. This doesn't apply to me, and I hope that is true. But almost any activity which is not saturated with Krishna consciousness is a kind of violence against other living entities. To make some money in this world, you have to get it from somebody else. If I have some, it means somebody else has to have less. And we hope that in the exchange of goods, where that transaction takes place, that there is some value created for the person giving the money. But we all know that more often than not, we spend our money on things that are not actually worth the cost that we spend. Especially if you're a young man trying to keep a family going in the past few years, you notice that the price of everything goes up every single day, whereas the value of that thing has not increased concomitantly. I just got my bill for car insurance for the year. It's up 12% annually. Why? Is there any increase? Is there a 12% increase in service offered? Absolutely not. So this is a minor form of violence, but this is also a violence. In most cases, when we perform some monetary transaction, the exchange is not equal. And that's a kind of violence. And what to speak of trafficking in goods produced by slaves, which is unfortunately endemic. It's everywhere. There's hardly any industry that we're involved in that doesn't have any sort of slavery tied to it. Unless, of course, you live a very pure and simple life. Gita. Even still, I mean, there's got some products that could have been touched by slaves.
Now in the EU, they're trying really hard, at least they passed some sort of resolution amongst EU nations to prohibit sale of goods that have been tied to slave labor. But everybody's criticizing, saying that's almost impossible to enforce because practically every industry, raw material, has in some way taken advantage of slave labor or indentured servitude. And so there's violence committed. This is a real thing. There's violence committed just to make simple economic exchanges. And what to speak of violence committed by, making money, selling stuff, whatever. A person who, thinking in terms of I and mine, aham mameti, my family, my community, is inclined to distinguish between theirs and others. And this is more or less the basic principle of every conflict in human existence, and every war, and every ridiculous fight. That people who live on opposite sides of an imaginary line drawn by imperialist nations 200, 250 years ago could just continuously kill each other. They're thinking in terms of I and mine. Ato griha kshetra sutapta vitaya janasya moho yamaham. This is absolutely bewildering. It's not an innocent thing. And how do they always justify it? We have to protect our children, our wives and our children. We must protect them against these barbaric attackers on the other side of this imaginary line, who ethnically are almost completely identical to me. But anyway, there's this imaginary line. It's us versus them. This is absolutely bewildering. So my point is that it's not an innocent thing to be in the bodily concept of life. There is gradation, as Srila Prabhupada's very graciously saying in this purport, referencing the opinion of Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur. There's a gradation. What is that gradation? That there's one class of man who, in ignorance, thinks his body to be his self and is like an animal. Sa eva gokara. And this is ignorant, and it's unfortunate. But there's a second class who not only thinks of his body as his self, but also commits all kinds of sinful activities to maintain his body. What we should understand, dear devotees, when looking upon society today, because it is our intention to help them, to save them, that is part of the Krishna consciousness movement, that we should consider that people who commit sinful activity to maintain their body do so because of being subjected to miserable conditions. The soul is Satchidananda. Everyone's soul is pure, part and parcel of Krishna. But in contact with material energy, being subjected to miserable conditions, people develop terrible qualities. Srila Prabhupada says this explicitly in a purport in chapter 7 of the Adi Lila Chaitanya Charitamrita, where he says, nowadays people have such miserable conditions because they have such terrible qualities because they are subjected to miserable conditions. Many people do not even have a choice but to commit sinful activities to maintain their body and their self. They might not be directly involved in it, but they're forced. They have no other option but to work in industries which commit violence against others. When we look upon the face of society and see so much papa, so much sin, we should recognize that this is a systemic failure. It's very easy to just say, oh, they're all bad people. They're all just so horrible. But we should try to reckon, and there are some horrible people, there's no doubt. We should try to recognize that this is even more so a systemic failure, where society is not organized in such a way that people can have their needs met without having to commit sinful activities. So at the end of the day, everyone is going to maintain their body one way or another. And if the only options are to be involved in industries that commit violence against others, then that's what they'll do. Is that the failure of that individual? Is it the failure of leaders of society, managers, to support opportunities to maintain oneself without excessive violence? It is certainly possible, but it's not very profitable. I'm not going to indulge in too much critique of particular nations or histories or economic systems, but we should recognize that most people in this world, because of being subjected to miserable conditions, therefore have terrible qualities. That's what Srila Prabhupada's perspective. Being subjected to miserable conditions. And therefore commit all sorts of violent, sinful activities just to get a little money, not because they want to. I've yet to meet some person who really wants to do some sort of terrible job. I've yet to meet the person who loves it. They do what they have to. We say have to because, of course, we could say, yeah, well, just live simply and go to some village outside of Vrindavan. Most people don't know anything about that. They're also in ignorance, and in ignorance that there's another way to live. Not ignorance like ignoring the other opportunities, the other possibilities, but in ignorance that they simply don't know. And that's our fault. So out of compassion for those living entities who are suffering in this material existence, we must make an opportunity for them to hear about alternative ways of living and teach them how they can live simply, how they can maintain themselves in a simple way without having to commit violence against other people, without having to get entangled in exploitative relationships with other people, and ultimately how to get out of the bodily concept of life entirely, because it is not an innocent affair. It is the pathway to misery in this lifetime, in the next lifetime, and for all sorts of living entities who come in contact with such a person. It's the pathway to misery for all. It's the bewilderment of all living beings. So we have the opportunity to help people to look beyond that, to get out of the bodily concept of life, to stop committing sinful activities just for a little profit. But without hearing from Srila Prabhupada, how will they know? How are they supposed to know? You think they're taught in public school, public education? You think they're taught we should not commit sinful activities. We should not exploit other people. No, they're taught the most efficient way to do it. How will they know? You know how many students here at Penn State are working on weapons? Penn State University has a ton of contracts with Raytheon, Lockheed Martin. They've got these offices just around the corner from me, actually. And Penn State contracts out their students to develop weapon systems. You know, I meet these guys, they're just trying to get a degree in computer engineering, you know, especially these Indian students, they're all doing computer engineering. And they, as part of their study, they have to work on projects for Penn State's profit, for Lockheed Martin's profit. And these kids pay to Penn State. And this is what they have to do to get their degree. They're part of these contracts for designing these weapon systems, making these missiles, which are killing somebody somewhere on the other side of the world. What are they supposed to do? Committing such violence against other living entities. And they tell me, like, well, this is what I have to do. I can't not do this project. It's part of my studies. If I want the degree, I have to do this project. So many contracts Penn State has with weapons manufacturers. What are you supposed to do? It's so entangled. It's a systemic failure, orchestrated by leaders of society, by leaders of these institutions, like this university. It's a systemic failure that for most people, they don't even have a choice but to be involved in committing violence against others. Of course, they do have a choice. They can drop everything and be Krishna conscious and live like some Baba. And for some, maybe they will. We have to recognize it's not so easy just saying, oh, all these people are so bad. They're so sinful. They're terrible. And so therefore, they're not worth my compassion. Many of them are innocent, victims of violence committed upon them. That's what Srila Prabhupada's essential perspective, which is so important for us to get. He says, nowadays people have terrible qualities because they are subjected to miserable conditions. They are themselves the victims of violence. So let's not indulge in simplistic, crude hatred of people who are different from us and who are less fortunate than us. Srila Prabhupada is being very gracious in this purport and making a distinction. And the opinion of Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur is also making a distinction. And really the whole subject of these last chapters of the 5th canto and the first chapters of the 6th canto are an expression of Maharaj predictions and Shukadev Goswami's compassion for suffering living entities. It's not their indulgence in gore and horror. It is to illustrate explicitly how dangerous is the bodily concept of life and how significant, how remarkable is the liberation effected by chanting the holy names of the Lord, even inattentively. Of course, as we're going to hear in the next chapter, the next canto. That's the purpose of all of this description. It's not they're indulging in violence. Like, ha ha, look at how all these people are suffering. We're so much better. We're not doing that. I know I'm saved. I'm not going to hell. That is not the mood here. Their mood is compassion and care for all the living entities who are suffering, playing with fire and the bodily concept of life, and how they may be easily emancipated from future suffering and bondage. With that in mind, we should read these chapters attentively with care. And if we feel some pain in our heart hearing these descriptions, let's make that pain an impetus to reach out to others, to help to inspire them in Krishna consciousness. It doesn't take a lot of expertise, but it does take some sincerity, some real compassion. Compassion is one of the most powerful spiritual emotions. It translates love of God into care for living entities of this world. Bhaktivinoda Thakur said this actually, that love of God, that same feeling of love of God when directed towards the living entities is called daya, or compassion. Bhaktivinoda Thakur said this. I can find the exact quote if you want. So let's not be the Prakriti Bhakta who's just concerned with the Lord. It's just me and God. I'm so great. I'm not going to hell. That same feeling of love for the Lord when directed towards the living entities is daya, compassion. So when reading these descriptions of the hellish planets and its segue into the 6th canto about Ajamil's liberation, we should be feeling some compassion. Take that pain that we feel in hearing this and direct it towards reaching out to someone who needs help. Just yesterday, one boy told me he's going to kill himself. It's kind of exhausting sometimes. But we should not doubt for a second. There are so many people who want relief from this suffering, who do not know how to exist in this world without being entangled in the bodily concept of life, who do not know how to live simply, free from sinful activity, who do not know how dangerous is identification with the body, do not know how to chant Krishna's names. It's not their fault that they don't know. It's our fault. So, Krishna consciousness. I need to go. I've been pretty busy on Saturdays, and this is the last Saturday. We have one more event here, and I have some guests as well I need to tend to. So I only have like 4 minutes to just ask if Taraka Prabhu or anyone else would like to say something about Krishna consciousness rather quickly, if you don't mind. Or you can continue without me. Antara Srimad Bhagavatam ki jai, Srila Prabhupada ki jai, Nitai Gaura Premanandi, Hari Hari Bol. Nothing? All right.
I got a quick comment, real quick. I
Yes,
think I'll try to make it quick. In was it text 7?
Mhm.
Let me quickly reference this. Yeah, so says some authorities say that there are a total of 21 hellish planets. Some say 28.
Mhm.
How
many did we read here? Was it 21, 28?
I didn't count.
Okay.
But perhaps you can shed some light on this issue in text. Is it 37? Text 37 later on, because that's not a lot of hellish planets, but there's a lot of varieties of hellish torment and a lot of sinful activities to be punished. So in the 37th text, it says, in part, my dear King Parikshit, in the province of Yamaraj, there are hundreds of thousands of hellish planets.
Yeah, I see that verse.
And the impious people I have mentioned, and also those I have not mentioned. So there's a lot more that has not been discussed. Evidently, this is just I guess a brief description of broader categories. And is that your understanding?
My understanding, yes, is that these names like Tamishra, Anda Tamishra, Rorava, could also be groups of planets and regions. Sometimes we hear the description of different regions, planetary systems, and it's not necessarily one globe. Of course, we're always thinking of planets like this globe that we have, but it could be regions of other description. And so that these 28 that were listed in text number 7 are more categories, because it does say explicitly in text 37, as you mentioned, Shatashaha Sahasrashas. So there's hundreds and thousands of such locations. Could also be that in this text 37, there are just 28 planets, and that there's other, like regions on those planets in the hundreds and thousands, just like there are countries on this planet or continents. As I've expressed before in our description, reading the descriptions in this 5th canto, I think that there's potential that some things are lost in translation, or that we are projecting our understanding of how planets are supposed to work just based on the few that we can see from here onto the rest of the universe. And that's why maybe some of these things seem inconsistent. It's probably just our own lack of understanding, either of the words themselves or the concepts described by the words. But that's just my opinion as a non-specialist in hermeneutics. What do you think, Taraka Prabhu? I'd love to hear what you think about that.
Well, as I say, I think the 27, 28 planets are broader categories within which there are many other subcategories. Anyway, I thank you for your input and for a very nice class, and I don't want to hold you up. You have important things to get to.
You have a guest here, and I prepare the offering for his Ishtadeva, his Lord. He needs a little earlier. So thank you, dear devotees, for tuning in and for participating. Srimad Bhagavatam ki jai.
Yeah, Shrev Prabhu, which verse you finished on, please?
We finished on number 10, I believe. So you please
Finished on 10.
continue